YouTube frogs! At long last, Mavuika is finally out and here to take her throne as the true Pyro Archon. Now that she's here, we can finally retire our old school Archons Bennett and Xiangling. Or can we? My name is Xlice and welcome to my complete and in-depth guide on Mavuika. In this video, I'll be explaining Mavuika's entire talent set and how to play her, then going over her constellations and emphasizing any early notable ones, then covering her best weapons, artifacts, overall stats and crit value to look for, and team comps. Let's dive into Mavuika. So first off, Mavuika has a key difference that makes her completely unique to the rest of the Genshin roster. Her burst does not cost energy. Say goodbye to everything energy recharge, all those extra substats you usually aim for, and even maybe those ER timepieces you tried to farm for because of Emblem Domain. No more. Mavuika actually gains her burst charge from a different mechanic called Fighting Spirit. Fighting Spirit can either be gained from teammate normal attacks or teammates using Night Soul points. She gains Fighting Spirit a lot faster through Night Soul points than normal attacks, so Natlan teammates will charge Mavuika's burst faster, but everyone can still contribute. If you guys know who Acheron is from Honkai Star Rail, this burst mechanic is kinda similar since they both do not use energy but rather charge up from external sources. So this means Mavuika is the first completely energy recharge free character in Genshin Impact. Yeah, I know some characters don't need their burst and technically don't need ER, but Mavuika is the first true character where ER is a dead stat. Okay, so that's her big unique mechanic. Now what does she actually do? Her kit has two forms depending on her E. If you tap, she becomes an off-field pyro applier. It attacks every 2 seconds with decent range and functions very similar to Raiden Shogun's E. Energy generation from this ability happens on initial cast, which doesn't actually matter for Mavuika, but it may for any teammates you have with her. If you hold, she gets on her motorcycle and performs on-field attacks using Night Soul points in the process. Normal attack does a 5-hit motorcycle combo, and charge attack causes her to spin in a circle, constantly dealing pyro damage. While not quite the same thing, this might remind you of a different ability that spins in a circle and deals pyro damage. Unfortunately for Mavuika though, her charge attack has normal ICD, so expect to vape or melt every 3 attacks per enemy. However, in Night Soul form, it does not have stamina consumption, so she's only consuming Night Soul points when she uses her charge attack. Regardless of her form, her C0 Night Soul limit is 80 points, so on average, expect about 10 to 12 seconds of uptime performing attacks. If you're using it for overworld traversal, then consumption will vary depending on how you're traveling. So, between these two forms, which one should you use? Interestingly enough, her kit allows solid usage of both without any downside. Of course, you can run pure off-field Mavuika or pure on-field Mavuika, but the beauty in her design is that you can actually get value out of both on and off-field versions in optimal team comps with proper rotations. Here's the thing though, by default, both of her E forms don't do that much damage. The multipliers on her E for both off and on-field are solid, but they don't scream Archon level OP. She's gonna need her burst form for that. So, bring in this Fighting Spirit value we were talking about earlier. She has 200 max Fighting Spirit, and if she has at least 50% of that, which is 100, she can cast her burst. When she bursts, her on-field E-kit and Burst Duke gains scaling attack percent based on how much Fighting Spirit was consumed. So, the more Fighting Spirit, the more attack percent she gains. At level 8 talent level, she receives the following attack percent. So, if you have 100 Fighting Spirit, then 256% attack for her Burst Nuke, 44% attack for on-field normal attack, and 88% attack for on-field charge attack. If you're at 200 Fighting Spirit, which is max, double all those values. 512 for Burst Nuke, 88 for on-field normal attacks, and 176 for on-field charge attacks. But that's not all. Her A4 passive also gives the active character damage bonus based on her Fighting Spirit at 0.2% per. So if she's on-field DPS, 100 Fighting Spirit is giving 20% damage bonus, and 200 is giving 40% damage bonus. If she's off-field, she'll be giving this damage bonus to whoever the on-field character is. Unfortunately, this bonus isn't permanent though. It slowly decreases to 0% over 20 seconds. And then the final buff she gets is from her A1 passive. If one of her teammates triggers a Night Soul burst, she'll gain 30% attack for 10 seconds. Well, this is basically just free 30% attack because Night Soul burst is nearly always active if the team has at least one Natlan character. Mavuika is from Natlan, so as long as any team member deals elemental damage, they will proc a Night Soul burst and she'll be 30% attack stronger. So, tallying up all the buffs, this is what you can expect from Mavuika. With a max 200 Fighting Spirit ult at level 8 talent, A1 and A4 passives active, Burst Nuke will gain 542% attack and 40% damage bonus. On-field charge attack will gain 206 attack, on-field normal attack will gain 118 attack, and of course 40% damage bonus for both of those. You'll notice that all of these insane bonuses are only given to her on-field form. This kind of incentivizes you to play her in motorcycle mode. She gets even more with Constellations, but we'll get into that later. So, how do you play her? Insanely simple. Lead with tap E Mavuika and then team setup, similar to how you lead with ride and E before setting up for her burst. This allows for initial pyro application that you can react with for a Viridescent Venerer or Scroll of Cinder City set, depending on your supports. Then you do your normal team setup and then swap into Mavuika and burst. When she bursts, she immediately goes into motorcycle form with 10 Night Soul points and doesn't consume any of it for 7 seconds. During this 7-second window, she gains all the attack buffs mentioned previously and also gains massive interruption resist, so you can literally spin to win. After her burst duration is over, her E cooldown should be ready from when you started the rotation, so you can either hold E and continue spinning or tap E and prepare your team for the next rotation. Just a quick tip for how to play her here. After her Q ends and you press E, she might be in motorcycle mode even if you don't want her to be. Don't spam tap E again here, it'll take another second due to the cooldown. Just swap out and she force changes her form to tap E mode. Swapping out, no matter what form she's in originally, will force her into off-field mode, so this saves you a little hassle of min-maxing the form. After burst is over though, Mavuika's hold E damage is pretty flimsy, so it's actually not recommended to continue on-field DPS. This time is better spent using off-field Mavuika and waiting out the cooldown of her burst while generating fighting spirit with the rest of your teammates. Off-field Mavuika E will still continue to use her normal Night Soul point gauge, so she still gets full fighting spirit value even when not on field. With the base limit of 80 Night Soul points, she's able to self-generate 80 out of 200 for her fighting spirit back. If you just want to play off-field Mavuika, you are still going to activate burst immediately for that A4 passive damage bonus to the active character, but you'll skip her actual burst form benefits, set up her E, and then switch out. In both cases, Mavuika has probably the easiest playstyle in the game. She is not energy reliant, so no need to funnel particles to maintain her burst, and both rotations are basically just pressing 2 buttons. For on-field, you Q and then you hold left click. For off-field, you Q, then tap E and then swap characters. So these two alone may actually be a huge incentive for new and veteran players alike. She has lower build requirements since you don't need to rely on ER at all, and she's pretty easy to play. Talent priority. So both her skill and burst are top priority investments for multipliers and scaling. Her skill has all the damage multipliers for off-field or on-field, which scale per level. Her burst has the initial burst nuke multiplier and all her increased attack percent scaling corresponding to her fighting spirit, which both scale per level. For overall DPS increase, her burst talent comes out slightly ahead because the nuke multiplier is a large part of her rotation and she also gets attack bonuses from fighting spirit. Her skill multipliers are also very valuable and are barely behind her burst, so you should really level both at the same time. For technicality purposes, max her burst before her skill. Normal attack can be left whatever you desire since it basically has no function for 99% of her gameplay. So now you know how she works. Let's go over some highly requested, frequently asked questions to help you decide if she's worth it for you. First question, Mavuika or Arlecchino? Probably the most popular question of them all, since these two are head to head in terms of DPS output. In my opinion, the answer lies in the number of supports and investment on your account. Mavuika is reliant on specific supports more so than other characters. While I have seen a lot of people argue that, well, every DPS can be OP with Shoutout, Xlice, Furina, etc., while Mavuika is more dependent on Natlan specific characters for fighting spirit conversion. She obviously gets best in slot buffs from these characters just like everyone else, but unlike everyone else, she loses far more than just the buffing power, and this pushes her below competitive DPS in an already saturated market. While Arlecchino also suffers from the same problems, she's a lot more versatile in the supports that she can run. One example of this is her availability to run Overload Chevreux without sacrificing a tremendous amount of innate power. Mavuika suffers heavily in the same predicament because she just lost every Natlan support she can use besides Auroron, and then she's forced to include Chevreux and likely Bennett, limiting her fighting spirit generation. That being said, Mavuika does come out on top if you have her best team available. Shoutout, Xlice, and Bennett has a very high ceiling for damage output, and the team rotation is about as simple as it gets, besides an optional Mavuika jump cancel in the middle. It is also possible that future patches release more best-in-slot supports for Mavuika, but at the time of this guide, we don't know. Question 2. If I don't have Shoutout or Xlice, should I pull? The simple answer is no. While you can make do with just one, not having both cripples a core part of her team, and the rest of the Natlan current cast just doesn't cut it for competitive team DPS. Question 3. I do have one of them. How viable is she then? If you have Shoutout, pretty good. Her most important support unit by far. Xlice is replaceable to some extent with competitive choices like Furina and then other 4-star Cryo or Hydro supports. if you have Xlice but don't have Shieldin, it's okay. To replace Shieldin means you are incentivized to use Kazuo or Sucrose to maintain some sort of shred. While they do work, their rotations are tricky, and the damage output will still be lower. Sucrose puts in some decent work here, and the rotation is actually quite kind, making her an acceptable pivot for newer players. Both of these comps are demonstrated in the team comp section. Q4, I have C0 Mavuika, but I have only enough for one more 5-star. Do I go for C1 or R1 or Xlice? The next section will talk about C1 and why I don't personally like it, but in general, I'd recommend Xlice, then R1, then C1. For the reasoning, new characters are always more beneficial than extra cons or weapon, and then R1 is a bigger boost than C1 in ideal situations. Only go for C1 if you can guarantee C2. So now let's discuss Mavuika's Constellations and how much stronger she gets with each one. C1. Max Night Soul limit increased from 80 to 120, and also Fighting Spirit is gained 25% more effectively. So these two changes scale off of each other. So 120 Night Soul will give her 25% more Fighting Spirit, so 150 instead of 120. At C0, she is converting 80 Night Soul to 80 Fighting Spirit. With C1, that almost doubles to 150 Fighting Spirit. This basically makes her more effective in non-Natlan teams where her teammates aren't giving her Night Soul point conversion, because she can generate 150 out of 200 by herself. Otherwise, you'll be able to get 200 Fighting Spirit much faster than normal, guaranteeing max burst benefits every time. You'll also notice that if she has no problem getting 200 Fighting Spirit in whatever team you're running, this part of C1 becomes rather useless. And so, she also gets free 40% attack to compensate. C2. In Night Soul state, she gains 200 base attack and also differing benefits based on off-field or on-field. For off-field, her attacks shred 20% defense. And on-field, motorcycle, normal attack, charge attack, and burst nuke gain an additional attack multiplier damage value. Based on level 8 talents, this is the expected DPS gain you should see. For charge attacks, 90% attack multiplier is about a 45% average gain. For burst, 120% multiplier is about a 17% gain. The 200 base attack gain should also be providing her an 18% DPS gain based on 1.1k base attack with a signature weapon at level 90. So she's getting a pretty sizable upgrade with C2. Just estimating based on these numbers, she's probably about 35 to 45% stronger with C2. C3, C5 are standard level bonuses, with burst being 3 and skill being 5. C4, damage bonus from A4 passive no longer decays and also gains plus 10% for 50% total. Honestly, this one will probably feel unnoticeable to most people, since her on-field damage is heavily front-loaded, so she's gaining most of the initial value anyway. C6. Now this is just all big booms. For off-field, the ring gains an extra 200% attack multiplier AoE damage. At level 8 talent, this looks like this doubles the damage. For on-field, she hacks her off-field ring onto herself as well and also gains a 20% defense shred and a 500% attack multiplier boom every 3 seconds. But most importantly, and only available at C6, her overworld traversal gets a second wind and she can zoom farther. Now you can really ride off into the sunset. Memes aside, C6 gains very large extra attack multipliers that will do very big numbers and kill things, probably. Overall, this is what I expect from her Constellations. So C1, the Fighting Spirit will generate faster, but it may not improve much for her optimal teams, but she does get 40% attack. C2, probably the strongest stopping point. It's a solid DPS gain and the best one you're going to get for the Constellation value. C4, in my opinion, is going to be barely noticeable. And then C6, minus 20% defense shred and an extra big nuke. It's worth noting that the 500% attack multipliers do not apply pyro, but do qualify as pyro damage. For those interested, these 500% attack multipliers apply 0 elemental gauge units, which basically means they do not apply elemental aura and do not react. This is probably to prevent the C6 Yoimiya situation where her original vape combo on 147 attacks gets ruined with C6. C6 Mavuika is safe. Her melted attacks do not change with C6. Alright, now let's talk about how to build her. First up, best artifact sets and main stats to run with her, either on-field or off-field. For either of these playstyles, it's a no-brainer to target the Obsidian Codex and Scroll Domain. Obsidian Codex will easily be her best in slot set to run for DPS because she gets guaranteed 40% crit rate always active and a free 15% damage bonus. This set has been out for most of Natlan, so most of you guys should have a decent set on this 4-piece. If you don't have an available 4-piece Codex set, 4-piece Mara Chaussee is going to be her next best choice, but requires Farine to be running her team to constantly drain her HP. 36% crit rate and 50% charge attack damage from this set is pretty close to Obsidian Codex, just ever so slightly worse. In general, for on-field, I'd recommend just aiming for the Obsidian Codex set. There's no no extra unit requirement for it, and it provides the strongest buffs and guarantees that she'll hit 100% crit rate without much investment. For pure off-field setups, Scroll of the Hero of Cinder City is the default choice. It will only buff the elements reacting with Pyro, so ideally this is used to support either a Hydro or Cryo DPS for Vape Melt. Besides that, there's no artifact set worth running on her besides just farming for the Nalan ones. In the meantime, you can always run a generic 2-piece attack scaling build. It will do just fine since she's a standard attack DPS. Alright, now let's talk about her main stats. So Mavuika probably has the easiest build path for main stats because she is not energy recharge reliant. This means her only two options are attack pyro crit or EM pyro crit. Now here's the thing, the main source of her damage is going to come from her burst activated motorcycle donut rings. While she's in burst form, she's going to be buffed by a trillion things, including her fighting spirit conversion, Bennett, pyro resonance, and any of your team setup buffs. If we take our minimal calculation from talents, she's got at least 200% bonus attack on charge attacks and 500% bonus attack on burst nuke from just herself without Bennett buff, artifact sets, and resonance. So Mavuika actually gains very little from attack percent main stat timepiece. That 46% main stat is going to barely grant her 10 to 15% DPS since she's already at nearly 300 to 400% attack. So we're actually looking at EM timepiece to be the most optimal setup for her, avoiding heavy diminishing returns. Even though Mavuika has internal cooldown and won't be able to react most of her hits, the gain from EM timepiece will outweigh the general DPS gain from attack main stat. This holds true even for heavy EM team support setups. The amount of attack she gains naturally is just so high that an attack timepiece provides very low value. But if you don't have an EM timepiece ready, that's okay. We all know how hard they are to farm. Attack main stat will always be there to comfort you in your sleep, even though it knows it's never going to be number one for Mavuika and it will be replaced at some point. The Goblet and Circlet are going to be hard fixed. There's no better option than Pyro Goblet or Crit Mask. In terms of substats, make sure to cap her crit rate at 60% before Codex buffs, and then grab as much crit damage as possible. Attack and EM are the last two substats to aim for, with EM generally being better since she has so much attack like we mentioned. Now let's talk about her best weapons. To help you guys figure out what works best for you, I calculated all the relevant claymores that I think you use or that I think that you can get without much effort. Debate Club R5 is included on this list for the ultra new players and also so you can see the comparison with a 3-star weapon. The weakest claymores on this list that I consider are Blackcliff Slasher, which is buyable from the shop, or Tidal Shadow, which is craftable from Fontaine. All weapons besides Debate Club that are weaker than those two are not included in this list to help simplify your decision. If no weapon that you have is on the list, then I'd recommend buying one copy of Blackcliff or forging one copy of Tidal Shadow. That being said, Tidal Shadow is expected R5 on this list, so R1 will be weaker. The rankings on this list are determined with a completed 240 crit value build capped at 60% crit rate on an optimal team with the corresponding reaction. Some weapons perform pretty well, but have a massive caveat like overcap crit that I will go over individually. Alright, so middle of the pack. Best F2P choice running Vape or Melt Mavuika is Mailed Flower R5. This is available as an event weapon back in the Windbloom event. If you've got this lying around and no 5-star claymores, use it. It's really good, no requirement passive, and it is the basis of comparison for the rest of this list at 100%. Now let's go down from top to bottom. Signature. Best in slot everything, at least 10% better than any other weapon at the same refinement. Bacon will perform well if not overcapping crit rate. Since it gives 33% crit rate by default, this is really difficult to build around since you'll need all crit damage substats to compensate. The difference from Signature is 22% crit rate. So if you manage to build around it, cap your crit rate at 60%, but your build gains 44 crit damage, then the damage will be there. Personally not recommended due to the build difficulty. Fang of the Mountain King, stolen from Kanish, it's her second best weapon in general. Same base attack and crit rate, passive massively boosts her burst nuke and allows the weapon to be just 10% weaker in a general rotation. Wolf's Gravestone, standard attack stat stick, but falls off compared to crit claymores. Due to her inherent high attack percent, only use this as a stat stick. Verdict, solid crit stat stick. May encounter overcapped crit rate, but not as bad as Bacon, with just 22% instead of 33%. Stone Thresher, this is just a generic good crit damage stat stick. Unforged, it's good damage, but too many requirements to pull off. Generally not recommended because shield requirement and initial stacking are necessary, and weapons like those, for how fast Genshin is, are not really that optimal. Serpent Spine R5, competitive to 5-star claymores if you can keep its passive online at all times. R1 is still good as well. Best in slot 4-star theoretically, but it's very risky to maintain because if you do start losing stacks, then her damage falls off. Rain Slasher R5, pretty good, but only for vaporized teams because you do need the enemy to have Hydro on them. Blackcliff Slasher. This weapon is able to keep up with these other 4-stars only because of its crit damage secondary stat. If you manage 1 stack of its passive or higher at all times, it's pretty good. It's competitive with other 4-stars. Against stronger Abyss floors though, expect maybe 0 stacks due to lack of enemies if there's just like 1 boss enemy. Tidal Slasher. Starting weapon stat stick, it's doing its job, it's craftable, you got it. Debate Club. Hey man, it's a classic. It's hanging in there. So overall, the weapons that perform the best usually have crit or elemental mastery. This is expected. We know that Mavuika's highest natural stat is attack, so we want to balance this with other sources of damage from crit, damage bonus, or elemental mastery. In general, I'd recommend the following weapons. Signature, of course, and then a crit damage or low crit rate secondary stat 5-star, then the mailed flower, and then anything else on this list. Weapons that don't have a difficult condition to meet, I generally place more value on even if they are slightly weaker than the alternative. As an F2P, you'll probably gravitate towards Tidal Shadow, Blackcliff Slasher, or Mailed Flower if you've been playing for a while. If you're a low spender or buy the Battle Pass, Serpent Spine is on the table, or any 5-star stat stick claymore that you may have gotten or lost to 50-50 to. Also, let me know in the comments what you think about the weapon ranking and if it helps you decide what to use. Alright, so now let's go over what to expect from the stat page with a full build. First thing you'll need to ignore because it's going to look weird, the attack. On her ideal build with EM main stat, the stat page window is going to have very mediocre attack because a lot of her attack is not shown. The entirety of her post-burst attack conversion from Fighting Spirit is not shown because the attack value she gains is different for each part of her own kit. For example, her burst nuke is going to have the largest attack bonus, charge attack being second, and normal attack being third from the Fighting Spirit conversion. So having about 1.4 to 1.8k attack is going to be completely normal on this stat page. If you run attack main stat because you're trying to find an EM main stat and you don't have one yet, expect this value to be 1.8 to 2000. For crit rate, as close to 60% as possible. You might be under or slightly over, just get as close to possible so that Obsidian Codex can get you to 100%. Crit damage. With their signature weapon, expect somewhere between 200 to 240 crit damage with proper artifact distribution. In general, the lowest range of crit damage from non-crit weapons will probably be 180 to 200%. And then the highest range of crit damage from heavy crit weapons will reach 260 to 300%. So if you're anywhere in this wide range, then you're doing okay. ER ideal is 0%, and then Pyro Goblet for 46 pyro damage. Elemental Mastery, get as much as you can get after crit damage. Minimal is 187 from the main stat, or even 0 if you don't have one, but there's generally no real recommendation as long as you're looking out for it. I would say that ideal capped builds will probably have between 250 to 300. Team comps. So now let's talk about Mavuika's best team comps and also a lot of alternatives that you can use. This way you can decide how much you are willing to sacrifice for Mavuika's damage. We'll be doing our demonstrations on the Capybara, since he's got a sizable HP pool to act as our target dummy. So, the most crucial part of our team comps is the need for Fighting Spirit generation, which is primarily done with Natlan characters. We've got Shieldin, Sitlali, Auroron, Kachina, Pyro MC, Mualani, Kanish, and Chaska. For main DPS Mavuika, we are ideally going to choose Shieldin, Sitlali, Auroron, Kachina, and Pyro MC. Sub DPS or dual DPS Mavuikas can operate around Mualani, Kanish, and Chaska. These teammates will be able to provide decent Nitro points to Mavuika, so her burst stays fairly full before each rotation. First, let's cover her DPS teams, because these will be the most common. Her best of the best lineup is going to run Shieldin plus Sitlali plus Bennett. We achieve forward melt in this comp and are able to melt her burst nuke and 2 to 4 charge attacks during a full rotation. Shieldin primarily gives shred debuff and healing. Sitlali is our Crawl Applicator and additional Pyro Shred, and holds TTDS or Signature Weapon for attack transfer or elemental mastery. Bennett is attack buff, Pyro Resonance, healing, and C6 pyro damage bonus. This comp has the highest DPS ceiling for Mavuika possible, and does achieve pretty decent sub DPS from Sitlali herself. For the rotation, Mav tap E into Shieldin EQ, into Bennett EQ, into Sitlali QE to guarantee Q melts, and then Mav Q and charge attack spins. Now there are 2 optional techs to increase Mav's DPS instead of just holding left click during the entire fight. The first is jump canceling Mavuika's 4th charge attack to delay it for Sitlali's Crawl Application to hit first. The second is to release left click after the 3rd charge attack to finish her charge attack animation with dive attack, and then repeat once more. This enables 3 potential melts on 2 charge attacks and 1 dive attack instead of just 3 charge attacks, giving a slight increase in damage. So, these techs are not that difficult to pull off, and if you get used to it, it's free damage. Courtesy to Spanish creator Okram and to Jeff for the info, I was just scrolling through Twitter and saw this. From this team, we can branch into alternatives. Shielonen can be replaced by Kazuha or Sucrose to maintain some sort of shred and some sort of buffing. You will lose fighting spirit generation in this case, which is a necessary evil. Kazuha is very tricky here. We want Q to Cryo Swirl because a Pyro Swirl will steal all of Mawika's melts. But because Kazuha's self-infusion by Burst, it is impossible to Cryo Swirl Xlice if used after Bennett. We also want at least 1 Pyro Swirl, so he shreds and provides Mavuika some buffs. I tried a lot of variations with my Twitch chat, and we had to change quite a couple things. Can't Mavuika tap E or it ruins Xlice's cryo application, so you have to do it later. Have to Kazuha Q first before Bennett, or you just give up Kazuha Q entirely and just E right before Mavuika enters battle. Overall, we were able to make it work, but the rotation is clunky and all the buffs were only simultaneously active for a couple seconds after Mawika's Q. Let me know in the comments if there's some Giga Tech with Kazuha that allows him to work properly without a lot of these caveats. Now, Sucrose was a bit easier, and because of that, I actually preferred her rotations over Kazuha for Mavuika. Sucrose Q doesn't suffer from self-infusion, so she can be used on Bennett Q after Xlice setup for her Q cryo infusion. With optimal Sucrose artifacts, I can see her not having any energy issues and being a reasonable alternative for Melt Mavuika. Rotations for these comps can be seen on the screen. If you're running Kazuha, use Xlice normal attack into Kazuha Q, Bennett EQ, Xlice QE, Kazuha E, and then Mav Q. If you don't Kazuha Burst, then you can lead with Mavuika Tap E, Bennett EQ, Xlice QE, Kazuha E, and Mav Q. Make sure that Kazuha E after Xlice does Pyro Swirl. For Sucrose, Bennett E, Sucrose E, Bennett EQ, Xlice QE, Sucrose Q, Mavuika Q. We do Bennett E because we don't want Mavuika E to maintain too long. Bennett E gets the power application for Sucrose to swirl and transfer buffs to Mavuika before the setup happens. Those are the main DPS rotations I wanted to share with you guys in detail, since all the rest of the rotations basically share the same premise. Now, let's replace Xlice. The second best alternative will unsurprisingly be Furina. With Shielonen and Bennett, this comp is Mavuika's strongest vaporized comp, and the comp shouldn't be that surprising. Furina plus Shielonen plus Flex is pretty much universal best in slot supports for a vast majority of units. Attack scalers will add Bennett for Flex, HP scalers will probably add Kazuha for Flex, and defense scalers will probably add Goro or Zhongli for Flex. Now we're going to go into territory of less common Natlan teammates if you don't have the premium supports like Shielonen or Xlice. We first got Auroron. This one's a little difficult since Auroron is Electro Element, forcing you to sacrifice Melt or attempt Overload. If we include a staple like Xlice, Fighting Spirit generation is pretty good, but melts cannot be guaranteed. If we instead want Overload Mavuika, we'll be required to run Auroron and Chevreuse as our core. The last slot is a pick your poison type situation. Either we commit to Bennett because his buffs and typing are broken, or we can go Glass Cannon route with Pyro MC to maintain Fighting Spirit generation. Problem with Pyro MC is you have no survivability in that team comp. In these setups, rotation is the same. You Mavuika tap East to start, you Auroron EQ, Bennett EQ, Xlice, and then Mavuika Q. At the time of recording, I don't have Pyro MC yet since I haven't had the time to do the Archon quest, so a Chevreuse showcase will have to do. This comp with Auroron Chevreuse is very easy to play. It's just the damage numbers are lacking. Without Melt to multiply the damage, this is pretty inevitable, but at least we have decent Fighting Spirit generation, about 75% of the bar per rotation, and Shred from Chevreuse. Alright, finally, Kachina. So don't mind my level 20 Kachina here. She's doing her best and what she needs to do for this showcase. As a Geo character, she can likely be used in Mono Pyro with Mavuika. No reactions is pretty limiting, but we're working around her Fighting Spirit generation, so there's really not much we can do. This is obviously assuming no Shielonen in this team, because otherwise we'd be going for the previous comps that we mentioned, which are premium. So with Kachina, we'd probably run Mavuika and Zhongli and Bennett as a double Geo double Pyro core. This team is probably the most comfy lore-wise, since Mavuika and Zhongli's JPVAs are married, so it's kind of fitting if you care about that, with limited shred and limited buffs. Mavuika's damage is the lowest here, but this comp is playing for comfort and not damage. So those basically summarize the main DPS comps. I'm sure you've noticed, but yeah, the one character that is in basically every comp is Bennett. He's honestly the true Pyro Archon here and can't really be replaced since he's got perfect synergy with Mavuika besides Fighting Spirit generation and the fact that you have to play Circle Impact. But he's a 4-star, making him accessible to nearly everyone, and probably most people can activate C6 now because we're at that stage of the game where the design of characters is changed so that Bennett can't override them. Maybe in the future, we'll get a 5-star, maybe even Natlan version of Bennett. Probably not, but you know, maybe. All right, sub DPS comps. So a couple showcases for sub DPS Mavuika, where she does not go into motorcycle mode and instead just supports with her power application. We first have Giga Vaporized Mualani. With premium supports, we compare Mualani with Shoutout, Mavuika, and Nahida for maximum vape burn Mualani. Shoutout leads the rotation after Mualani's normal attack for scroll buff. Nahida and Mavuika set up their burn afterwards. There's quite a bit of variation on this team since Nahida isn't technically necessary here. Shoutout is a tried and true core support. It's really hard to give up her triple threat buff shred heal, and obviously this is a Mavuika guide, so we're including her as the core. If you want to further juice up this team, you can run dual DPS by replacing Nahida with Xlice. In that particular case, you'll lead with Xlice into Mavuika melt combo and then rotate into Mualani's vapes. Next up, we've got Kanish. This variation includes Farina and Bennett as the supports to maximize Kanish's damage. This setup is pretty straightforward and gains a lot of extra damage from Farina's vapes, so it ends up doing pretty well. The only major problem that you can clearly see from the showcase is circle impact. Kanish ideally wants to stay in Bennett's Q circle, and Kanish's E can sometimes cause him to drift out depending on enemy movements. Just bear that in mind and you're good to go. So I chose to set up Mavuika after Bennett for a nuke vape, but you can set up with Bennett last, just before Kanish for more buff timing. It's completely player preference. Next up, we've got Chaska. So Chaska is a bit iffy since we also kind of want Bennett on the same team, which ends up giving us 2 pyro units. Ideally for Chaska, we'd want 3 different PHEC, but it's kind of hard to give up Bennett for highest DPS. If you don't care about highest DPS, Chaska teams are pretty flexible. I'll be using Xlice in my demonstration since she's the other shiny new character on the banner. So in this team comp, we've got 2 pyro and 1 cryo, making our damage distribution focused on melts. Xlice really benefits Chaska due to her hydro pyro res drops, and the way that Chaska's bullets means that she's doing pyro, hydro, or cryo or electro damage, while also adding optio cryo application into the mixture for extra reactions. Optimally, here we like Bennett to be a hydro healer support to complement the element distribution. If we don't have one, that makes the switch worth it. If you have C6 Farina, that's a special case. Otherwise, it's down to Kokomi, Barbara, or Sejuin. Those 3, though, aren't worth the natural loss of DPS from Bennett, so I generally wouldn't recommend it. Alright, so those 3 are the main sub-DPS roles that complement Mavuika for fighting spirit generation. You can also technically use Neuvillette to pair with Mavuika for some vape gameplay, but you're basically sacrificing all of Mavuika's potential at the cost of marginal benefit to Neuvillette, so I really wouldn't recommend it. And that wraps up my complete in-depth guide on Mavuika. Overall, I think she's a super strong power DPS, but really wants some high-value Natlan characters to team up with her. Build path is super easy, playstyle is pretty straightforward, and no requirement for energy are all pretty good incentives. Let me know in the comments what you guys think of her. And if you have any questions, feel free to drop by my Twitch channel where my community and I answer most questions. I hope you guys enjoyed the video and maybe learned something you didn't know before about Mavuika. As always, thank you guys for watching, and we'll see you next time. Take care.